Welcome to Epilogue, the only show that cuts into the big issues behind the best books on politics and world affairs. I'm Derek Conway, and this week we're reviewing Money and Power, How Goldman Sachs Came to Rule the World by William D. Cohan. In today's epilogue, we'll review the book and the issues around it, but before we get right into the discussion and I introduce our studio guests, let's take a look at this brief introductory video.
In Money and Power, the author William D. Cohan peers behind the curtain to give us the inside story of why Goldman Sachs is so profitable and powerful. Cohan is the first author to chronicle and to interview the leaders of Goldman Sachs since the 2008 crash, and has gained unprecedented access to the firm's inner circle. The book reveals Goldman Sachs as a secretive money-making machine that has walked an uneasy line between conflict of interest and legitimate deal-making for decades, a firm that has assiduously cultivated power and exerted its influence over government to the extent that Sidney Weinberg, who ran the firm for nearly 40 years, advised American presidents from Roosevelt to Kennedy. It's a company kept in line by former CIA operatives and private investigators, and a workplace rife with brutal power struggles. In Money and Power, the author refers to Goldman Sachs as a symbol of immutable global power and unparalleled connections, which Goldman is shameless in exploiting for its own benefit, with little concern for how its success affects the rest of us. Today in Epilogue, we will review the book Money and Power, How Goldman Sachs Came to Rule the World by William D. Cohan.
Of the thousands of banks that make global finance tick, few are as big, rich and politically powerful as Goldman Sachs, which for decades has combined high finance with political muscle. Even in the darkest days of financial world chaos, Goldman Sachs managed not only to survive, but prosper. Is it just ruthless ability, or is there a murkier side to this American colossus? The author, William D. Cohan, is an award-winning journalist and Wall Street veteran who has acquired a reputation for fearless financial investigative journalism. And to review his book, I'm joined in the Press TV studios by two excellent experts. David Pidcock, machinery consultant and writer who gives lectures on Islamic economics and is a co-founder of the National Association for Victims of Fraud and Banking Malpractice, and James Meadway, a senior economist at the New Economics Foundation, who recently was a senior policy advisor at the Royal Society and is currently working on a PhD on financial markets at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. Welcome to you both.
Well, thank you.
This is a bit of a brick to carry around.
It is.
And you will have understood every page of it, where it was all a magic and mystery to me. But what did you make of it, James? Was it interesting?
Well, it's extremely thorough. I mean, obviously, you can see the size of the thing. It's very, very thorough, very detailed narrative history of Goldman Sachs, where it started and how it's come to be today. And very, very good in parts, I think. Some of the descriptions of some of the more complex bits that they've got up to recently, the way that synthetic CDOs work and all the kind of financial trickery, really, that's been taking place over the last few years. Some of that description, I think, is very, very good as a kind of guide to what was going on. Where it starts to be a bit weaker, I think, is it slightly lacks a kind of conclusion. It lacks a feeling that, well, this is what's going on in the world. This is our understanding of how the system operates. This is how Goldman Sachs really does end up being, you know, the biggest kid left standing. I mean, in part, of course, this is the nature of the beast that you're up against. That it's not just about Goldman Sachs in the end. This is an entire financial system that's a problem, and Goldman Sachs just happens to be the bank that, you know, was left standing after the last crisis. Lehman Brothers collapsed, Bear Stearns swallowed up, big investment banks that people would have thought would be around for decades more suddenly disappearing overnight. Goldman's still there, and this gives it the impression, I think, of a success or a magic about it that perhaps it doesn't really have. So maybe what comes through in his retelling of this story is that perhaps it's not so much that Goldman's doing anything special, it's that it just happened to be slightly better than everyone else. It happened to be slightly the right place at the right time.
Right time. What did you make of it, David?
Well, I think very much along the lines that James was mentioning. From my standpoint, this is an area that I've spent many years actually doing the editing of this book, The Crash, which studies the history of the abuse of money from Plato to NATO and beyond, basically. But you can see the same problems throughout history. I think with Goldman Sachs, when you look at the groups that they've got, Robert Rubin and the people who are actually in positions of power, if you're the head of the Fed and you're the head of the Treasury and you're the main advisors behind presidents, I mean, if you're the captain on the ship is going where you're telling it to go. And but the problem is that the system, the Federal Reserve, the whole system, is a fraudulent system, and then it was condemned by many senators. The House Banking Committee report in 1964 says the Federal Reserve is the greatest threat to our democracy. Now, this is a government body warning about the system. And
45 years ago, yeah.
Yes, but it's 64. But you go then, even you go through all the way back to when they founded the Federal Reserve. Henry Goldman made sure that the Federal Reserve of New York was the most powerful of the whole the 12 banks, but all of them are private. The Federal Reserve, Bank of England, even the Central Bank of Sudan is controlled by the Federal Reserve of New York. Now, most people don't know that.
Yeah.
So, Goldman Sachs is the last player, or the big player, but the system is one. It's one complete system, and there are some winners and losers, but they're never losing the way that the real economy is suffering because of these gamblers. And as Milton Friedman said at his birthday party, and Bernard Bernanke admitted that the Federal Reserve caused the crash, and it was engineered by them and prolonged by them. And so but Goldman Sachs and all the other players are part of this cabal. The Federal Reserve is the centre of the spider's hub, and these are all players, and they bail them out. As the Bank of England, we bailed out many, many times the lender of last resort. Even hearing Mark's evidence given in 1857, you see the same, almost the dialogue is the same as it is today.
Same always.
The same
but
problem.
I think it's interesting way, James, that Goldman Sachs, as you say, were as exposed as all the other banks when the crash came in 2008 because of obviously the problems with mortgage collateral. But it looked as if, from my reading of the book, and I may have misunderstood this, that they weren't actually holding any bad mortgages themselves. They were effectively gambling on which ones would be the good mortgages. So you might as well have been putting it on a horse. I mean, I hadn't realised that there was no collateral involved. It was purely a guess on what was going to happen.
I mean, this is the issue.
And yet involving billions of pounds.
It's quite extraordinary. They think that roughly what happened was that the mortgage market, the subprime mortgage market in the US began to collapse from 2006 onwards. But from that time, certainly by the end of the 2000s, precisely because of the deregulation that Rubin and others had pushed earlier, banks had just been, running mad, getting high in their own supply, rather. I mean, the synthetic collateralized debt obligations, which is what you're referring to here, these collections of not even mortgages, but bets on mortgages that you can then stack up forevermore. I mean, it's not quite creating money out of nothing, but it's getting dangerously close to that. And of course, the whole thing then disintegrates over 2007, 2008. You can't simply sort of print money forevermore. You can't just create debt forevermore. At some point, those claims have to be realised. Now, the impressive thing, in some ways, with Goldman Sachs is that they moved slightly faster on this. I think it's clear from the book that they were just a little bit quicker. They were ahead of the game in, I think, seeing the crash coming.
But were they ahead of the game, David, because they were just super bright, or were they ahead of the game because they had enough people in the system?
It was their system of trading.
Yeah.
And the Russian guy who was arrested because he'd stolen their device, basically. So they were able to crash the market. But remember, Gordon Brown in 2004, now this is long before the crash, warned the cabinet, and David Blunkett's diaries gave the game away. And I've questioned David Blunkett in public. He refuses to answer.
This is the former Home Secretary who was...
Former Home Secretary. They say when you got home you were likely to find him at home. But that's another story. The point was that in 2004, July, his diaries show that Gordon Brown came to the special cabinet review and he was saying and warned them that how bad things were going to become towards the end of 2008, and it's exactly in the time frame, and that they should start to get their house in order in preparation for that. And David Blunkett said that I put my hand on his shoulder and said, I'm amazed that you would want to still be Chancellor while this thing is going on. And he said there was deathly silence, and then everybody started to laugh. Yeah. And then Tony Blair, after, he said, only you could have got away with that. Yeah. But the point was, 2004, Gordon Brown knew what was coming, because it's all absolutely, it's all engineered.
Because it sort of started in Britain with Northern Rock.
Well, look, I've got to show you that. This is Milton Friedman said, look, The Federal Reserve definitely caused the Great Depression by contracting the amount of currency in circulation by 1/3 from 1929 to 33.
That's an arguable point. I mean, there's a huge academic
Bernard
debate
Bernanke, then at his 90th birthday, admits...
Bernanke agrees
yes,
with Friedman.
we did it.
They're both on the same side of this.
He's the head of the Federal Reserve.
There are other explanations for why the Great Depression happened. You can go through it. You can go through a kind of Keynesian argument. The argument that this is overinvestment leading to a collapse in demand, leading to a failure in the real economy, which then produces...
But the real issue that Keynes raised...
This is a monetarist argument. This is about saying it's the shrinking of the money supply that prolongs a Great Depression.
Well, what are people short about there?
That's not necessarily
of money,
the thing that
Keynes
takes
said
place.
what we're advocating spells the euthanasia of the rentier. Yeah. Now, Bernanke and all these guys are rentiers. They rent money. Yeah. They should have their hands chopped off. They should lose their heads because the system is destructive. It destroys everything, and war is inevitable.
At the sort of the focus of the book, obviously, rather than the sort of wider economics of it all. One of the things this firm seems to have been very good at, clever at, foresight, whatever you may say, is moving very senior executives into government. Wow. So they get close to presidential campaigns, most often Democratic, but they seem to be able to get on with most people, but they are very close to the Democratic Party. Were other banks doing that, or was that a Goldman way of operating to make sure they had people in high places who were brought up in their stable and would maybe just look after their interests if ever needed?
Well, I mean, every bank wants to get people that it knows and trusts and likes it in power. This is part of the operation of running any large corporation.
Yeah.
That's why, we see today that various lobbying firms have been bragging, was it Bell Pottinger, bragging about how they can influence government, and they'll do that on behalf of their clients. Now, Goldman does appear to be more successful about this. If you look just in Europe at the moment, with the appointment of Mario Monti as Italian Prime Minister, Papademos as Prime Minister of Greece, both former Goldman employees, both quite senior actually as it happens. You can get carried away, I think, by how much of this is deliberate. I suspect what you're looking at here is that you have a very large, very influential, very rich private sector institution that tends to attract a certain group of people into it, which is, people who are ambitious and clever and all the rest of it, and they end up moving on elsewhere in life. And that, I think, is the process you're looking at. It's because Goldman is a very, very large corporation that it's able to act like this.
Clearly it works for Goldman Sachs because they have many former employees who are indeed friends in high places, so that when the trouble really hit in 2008 and they needed their friends, this is what the author reports actually happened.
Goldman's recent public relations nightmares began in earnest in March 2009, when the firm appeared at the top of the list of counterparties that had received billions of dollars in payments funneled through AIG by the US government. As part of the second phase of the 2008 $182 billion bailout of AIG, the counterparty list had been kept secret for months and was only released after much public outcry. A narrative quickly developed in the zeitgeist that Goldman had somehow received a special benefit, along with its $14 billion thanks to its numerous Washington connections.
What I thought was interesting about that extract is that, of course, these billions that the American government was giving their banks, that the pounds that the British governments were giving British banks, of course, that's not the government's money, it's not the politicians' money, it's tax dollars, it's tax pounds, it's the people's money being given on an enormous scale. And I would have thought, David, this is clearly down to political influence, isn't it? I mean, if a banker had no political influence, why would a government do it?
Well, precisely. If you read all the if you read Jefferson's accounts of the banks, the problems, this has been a known problem. But look, the problem of the buck begins here. It actually begins in Chesterfield in 1688, when the plan was to bring the Amsterdam bankers here. We were Amsterdammed. The Bank of England is set up in 1694 with a debt to William, or levied on the British people, at 8% till the day of judgment. Now that has compounded to the fact we'll be paying maybe 70 to 80 billion in tribute, in interest, on a debt that should have died and should never have been created in the first place, because the Treasury should issue all the money. We shouldn't be borrowing a penny at interest from anybody, and that's been a known problem for thousands of years. In the reign of Sulla, the emperor, 80,000 usurers and bankers were executed, and they had a nove tabula, which is what's needed, a clean slate for all. Because unless you cancel debt, war and the meltdown of society will come, and you can't avoid it.
That's quite apocalyptic.
Yes.
Well, James, what do you make about the political influence that Goldman Sachs were wielding during this very critical time for them? They managed to get more than anybody else out of the pot.
It's the same with, I think, other banks as well. That you know, you're looking at a systemic crisis here. You're looking at something that affects every single bank. All of them take a hit, and then there's a desperate scrabble to be the people who get the slice of the government pie at the end of it. Now, I mean, there are extraordinary stories about this. The one part of it, perhaps it's political influence, perhaps it's the ability to have a quiet word with your pals in government who you've developed over many years at this point. The other part of it, of course, is it's simple, I think, a kind of blackmail. If you read Sandra Rawnsley's account of the years of Gordon Brown being in office, where shortly after Lehman Brothers filed for bankruptcy, it's a Sunday afterwards, the heads of the major British banks come in to meet Alistair Darling and basically say, look, if we're not given a bailout, and I'm paraphrasing slightly here, if we're not given some support, then on Monday morning we'll close all our branches, all the ATMs will shut, there's a massive run developing on the banking system, we have to get the money. So that I think is a real sort of panic that's also coming in there, and to an extent a kind of blackmail. These people come in and say, well, the only option is, well, we just have to shut up shop. Now, actually, what the government could have done at that point is say, well, OK, we can assist you, but we're going to do this by making sure that your investors take the hits, not taxpayers. We're going to nationalise a lot of you, and we're going to run them for the public interest. That would have been one option at the time. It's not the one taken, because instead you get these enormous bailouts of private sector risk.
As Cohan makes clear in his book, the link between Goldman Sachs and the White House, particularly on the financial side, but did it extend to foreign policy as well? I mean, obviously Goldman Sachs got strong links with...
all of them. I mean, wherever you've got people, even in Nigeria, where you have the finance minister is a member of Goldman Sachs, and wherever you go, you find the placement, and this is what all good businessmen do. They try and get people in positions of influence. But the problem that we've seen is exactly what happened when the Bank Charter Act failed. All the way with the lender of last resort has been the people, rather than stopping borrowing. And the Federal Reserve was the great tragedy for America. The Bank of England was the great tragedy for us. No government should borrow. It should create the money, and you would never have this problem. And when they say we're going to close the ATMs, well, you have to go to jail. But we'll put them in prison because they are the criminals. The criminal cabal in the city has been the biggest criminal entity in the history of mankind.
It's curious that there have been no prosecutions that I'm aware of in America or in Britain as a result of the collapse.
Players,
obviously, Madoff went to jail, but that was exactly. crime rather than...
Quite obviously.
Whereas, so everybody just argues in some misjudgments on $1 billion.
It's clear in this that all the time they play by the rules of the game, more or less. Yeah. I mean, occasional investigations and this sort of thing. It's the same with the other banks. They can all hold up their hands and say, well, we're playing by the rules. And unfortunately, the rules are incredibly lax, so no one gets prosecuted. And yes, of course, and they have their own hand in making sure that they're...
So where does transparency come into all this? Because if you've got senior bankers moving into the White House administration in and out, if you've got bankers, it doesn't seem to happen as commonly in Britain, but it seems very much part of the American system. Where does the transparency for the American public come in all this? How do they know what's going on with their tax dollars? It's all a big secret all the time, is it?
Yeah, I think fairly bluntly that there's an awful lot of deliberate obfuscation about what's been taking place. I mean,
so why doesn't Congress do more about this, David? Is it because too many are having their campaign funds?
Whoever challenges, Jesus walks on water, feeds the 5,000 to the applause of everybody. Only when he touched the money changers in the temple did he find himself in serious difficulty. Whoever's challenged the system throughout history, you will find with Lincoln, with Madison, presidents were assassinated. 3 days after Lincoln introduced his greenback dollar, the 17 points, he was assassinated. As soon as Kennedy, 5 months after he reintroduced it, he's assassinated. And so the politicians know. Only Mahathir in Malaysia had the courage to say, when the IMF came, IMF stands for Infant Mortality Fund, wherever you go. Mahathir did exactly. I took him a 5-point plan developed by James Gibbs Stewart, the Forum for Stable Currencies, and he implemented the 5-point plan, and within 3 days, everybody crashed except Malaysia. So when
has their political influence diminished now as a result of all the scandals?
I think this is an interesting case in point. The crash in East Asia at the end of the 90s, which Malaysia did relatively better out of precisely because they told the IMF where to go, has led to, I think, it's helped to lead to a real shift of policy and the way that countries, particularly in the South, now think about how they might run their economies. You're looking at potentially a real weakening of the influence of the IMF, and certainly a weakening of the influence of large American banks like Goldman Sachs. So the rise of countries like Brazil and China is directly a threat to the power of American capital.
Well, I mean, bankers might still be doing very well financially with bonus and things, but on the whole, it's not an occupation that the press and the public are saying, oh, these wonderful people, aren't they saints walking on the earth?
Lord Stamp was the one who was the chairman of Middle Bank, and he said banking was conceived in iniquity and born in sin. Bankers own the earth, take away their power to create credit, but with a flick of the pen they will create enough to buy it all back again. So if you wish to remain slaves of bankers, continue to them, allow them to can create money, etc.
But is their influence still as great, David, as before the crash?
Well, it's not as great as it was before the internet. People now on the street actually the clarity, faith, hope and clarity, that's what we want, is actually to see now what's going on. They can see it for themselves. But
do you think this will curtail the risks that bankers take?
I think that this is the beginning of the end for them. I do, seriously, because people I'm talking to now, people that 20 years ago when we were starting talking about this, they thought we were lunatics. But after Mahathir's success, and he did that within 3 days. In China, 2007, I took this book and my seminar for the founder of the stock exchange in China, Mr. Dai. Within 3 days, all the stuff I took was translated into Chinese, and everybody who was anybody. Now, on the day we were giving the seminar, Mr. Green, who was chairman of HSBC at the time, came for lunch with Mr. Dai. And Mr. Dai asked him what he thought about what I was saying, basically. And he said, well, off the record, I have to agree, but don't quote me. That was him. But basically, there is an end game, and I think we're seeing the beginning of that now. And
do you think that, James? Do you think we're seeing
It's a possibility. I mean, I think things like the Occupy Wall Street movement, the people down at St. Paul's, there's a real kind of sense of public
we're talking about
revulsion
sort of dozens of people out of millions, because once people understand, say, their pension funds are at risk. I mean, it's all right when it's a sort of demonstration that doesn't affect you, but when you actually then say to people, your pension fund's gone as well, isn't that when the public opinion will start to...
There's certainly a serious risk at the moment for this country, which has a very, very large, obviously, financial sector, and it's very, very much exposed to anything else that happens in the rest of the world because it is so internationalised, so sort of spread out like that. Anything happening inside the European financial system, which is certainly very likely, a very, very high possibility at the moment, will immediately impact on Britain and spread pretty much everywhere else. Now, that could then get us into another situation where, once again, the banks are all insisting on bailouts. Once again, we have a repeat of what happened in 2008.
Well, we need a lot more time to cover such a big issue, but I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. This is a fascinating book for those who want to see behind the PR machine that protects global banking from the glare of public examination. How desirable it is to have high finance and politics intermingle at such high levels and with such interdependency makes a mockery of democracy, even in America, where financial and political corruption are endemic. This book will make you pause for thought. I'd like to thank David and James for joining us, and I hope you've enjoyed the show. If you have a book you'd like the programme to review, we'd like you to keep getting in touch, and here's how.
Epilogue wants to interact with you. You can get in touch by emailing us at epilogue@presstv.co.uk. Join our Facebook page at Epilogue on Press TV, where you can suggest new books to review, watch past episodes, and leave your comments.
Keep your feedback coming, and until the next epilogue, thanks for watching.